So let's contrast this Foucauldian framework of discursive power that we've been developing with the traditional notion of power as the formal power belonging to the leader or sovereign of a nation, such as a king or lord. So this is the power over things like life and death, such as deciding who gets the guillotine and publicly executed, or who is granted a stay of execution and thus spared of their life by the sovereign. So sovereign power is also referred to as Hobbesian power because it was formulated and conceived by Thomas Hobbes, a political theorist who wrote the book Leviathan, which was a treatise in which he explained the reason why we have this power. And it's to avoid being in a state of nature, a lawless, ruleless, nasty and brutish and short existence where people are like cave people with no social bonds or responsibilities towards each other or trust towards each other, and thus devolve into stealing from each other or killing each other. In order to assure some security and live life without worrying about those basic animal concerns, we need to collectively enter into a social contract with one another and each vest some of our power into a higher power or leader or authority figure, such as a king or governing body of representatives who can then make decisions and enforce certain rules from above to keep the peace both within the land, between the citizens, through making a police force and enforcing it, for example, and a justice system, as well as protect us from outside threats such as building an army and a military force. So in the background of this slide is the cover of Hobbes's book Leviathan, and it shows the sovereign, the authority figure, the king. And if you look closely, the king is actually made up and composed of individual people. Like if you zoom in on his chest in that picture, you can see each member of the masses who are lending their power to a higher power in the form of the king, who is charged with executing their collective will. And often this possession of formal sovereign power is represented by some sort of object that symbolizes their reign, such as monarchs wearing a crown, as in the TV series The Crown, covering the reign of British monarch Queen Elizabeth II, or a scepter, as we also see in this picture, just on the right side being held in the sovereign's hand, or even a decorative sword. You can't see it because it's covered by the text, but on the left side of the slide, in the sovereign's right hand, he's holding a ceremonial sword that could also represent power as an object. Or sovereign power could be represented by the object of a throne, perhaps one that you play a game for. Or even take the movie The Lord of the Rings. Like in that movie, the ring of power is a very literal example in that whoever possesses the ring has all the power. So all of these physical objects serve as signifiers that bestow formal power upon whoever is holding them. And in this view, power is a static thing that can be possessed and exchanged. It's a very inert and stationary view in which power exists wherever the sovereign has made a law, and freedom exists in those spaces where the sovereign hasn't made a law. It's a very clear-cut and simplistic and reductionist view of power as just this thing that exists in some places and doesn't exist in other places. And it's centralized in the hands of a sovereign. Whereas Foucault sees power as being everywhere in a decentralized and diffuse manner. Even places that are apparently free and clear of formal sovereign power, that is where the sovereign hasn't made a law. So sovereign power, like I said, is the power over life and death, but Foucauldian power is the power over everyday life and what makes up our lives and livelihoods and life worlds in mass and in detail. So for Foucault, instead of power being a thing, it's a relation between things and between people. And we can use the analogy of basketball to demonstrate how power is dynamic and fluid and relational. So in a basketball game, Philosophers of sovereign power, like Thomas Hobbes, would say that the power lies in the ball itself, which is a tangible object that can be possessed and exchanged between players, just like a crown or a throne. But Foucault would say that power exists in the intangible, strategic relations between the players, depending on their positions and movements on the court. So you'd think that the player with the ball possesses all the power in the game, but power belongs everywhere in the field of play. Each player, even without the ball, can structure the field of possible actions for any other player or players at any given time based on their position and movements in the field of play. So the defensive player, the player wearing the black uniform positioned in front of the offensive player with the ball, is limiting and actively structuring the ball holder's options for potential actions in terms of where they can shoot, where they can move, who they can pass to. And then if we take two completely separate players who are away from the ball, they are each influencing each other's movements by moving around themselves. So the offensive player without the ball is trying to get himself open to potentially receive the ball if it passed to them, or while the defensive player is blocking and covering them and causing the offensive player to have to relocate their position in order to get open again. And both of these players are enabling and disabling the potential for action for the player with the ball, either allowing him to pass or restricting him from throwing the ball into that covered area. And as soon as another player, either on the same team or the other team, gets possession of the ball, the entire field of action is instantly restructured so that suddenly some players have more power in their movements over other players, even if neither of them are anywhere near the ball. Even the people who are in the crowd spectating are exercising their power in a way by cheering on the home team to motivate them and booing the away team to discourage or distract them. They have power in itself to make noise, to indirectly influence the field of play, even though they have no potential to be in contact with the actual ball itself. So again, in Hobbes' view, power only exists within the specified field of play, so that if the ball were to go out of bounds, the play would be stopped. But for Foucault, power isn't just on the court. It's flowing and circulating throughout the entire arena and everyone and everything within it. So our entire reality, there's LeBron James, at least in terms of our knowable and perceivable reality, is the field of play for power. The Miami Heat had very long possessions during that era. There's no place that's free from power relations because there's no place that's free from discourse. And everything falls within discourse, everything with meaning at least falls within discourse, so that everything falls within the court of play of power. We are constantly swimming in power. Power is the air between us. Power is connectedness. Power is relationships. There's no place outside of power. There's no freedom from power. We must find freedom inside of power because there's no escaping it. There's not a single place in the world or in everyday life that's free from meaning and thus free from discourse and thus free from power. Power is the grid on which we are always operating, whether we know it or not. So that freedom comes in, at least for Foucault, freedom comes in the awareness of this omnipresence of power. And freedom comes in the attempt to struggle and transgress against the current flows of power in attempts to redirect them, to open up new and different potentials for action. So for Foucault, power is the ability to structure someone else's field of potential action so that they are more likely to act in predictable ways. And this predictability of action ensures that power continues to circulate in favor of the established power holders and institutions, so that despite minor fluctuations and power being inherently fluid, the relationship between structure and agency continues to be one-sided in favor of the structure as opposed to the agency, and difficult for social agents to resist or fight against or even see or be aware that it exists and is affecting us in ways we may not realize. Just like the basketball player who's trying to get open to receive the ball, who is then being blocked by the position of an opposing player. It's not like a conscious thing where they just stop on the court and philosophize to themselves and say, my power is being restricted right now. They just unconsciously move in relation to the movements of this other player. So I hope that analogy helps demonstrate the relational aspect of power according to Foucault. So what defines a relationship of power, a power relation, it's a mode of action which doesn't act directly and immediately on others the same way a sovereign can directly act on the power of one of their citizens. It's more of an indirect action upon others' actions, on either their existing actions or actions which may arise in the present or future. And it's the subtle guiding of the possibilities for conduct and putting in order the desired outcome. So power is fluid and dynamic and everywhere, but those in power seek to make it less fluid and more predictable in terms of power flowing to them and away from others. So power is the conduct of conduct at a distance. So the first conduct in that phrase is like conducting, like a train conductor leads a train, or a conductor of an orchestra leads an entire orchestra just by moving their hands. And the second conduct in that sentence means our behavior, how we behave and carry ourselves. So our behavior is being conducted by others indirectly. This also means that power isn't a function of consent. Like that basketball player didn't consent to have another basketball player block them from receiving the ball, just as the away team didn't consent to having the crowd in the arena boo them. Power in this sense isn't a voluntary and official exchange of power and freedoms in a big picture way as it is with sovereign power. Instead, it's acting upon us in more subtle and small picture and everyday ways in the ways it structures and limits the field of our possible actions. So all the possibilities for the things we could do and act and say at any given moment, power is what's restricting that before we even say or act. It's restricting our potential rather than the act itself. So using Long and parole, it's not restricting our parole in our individual speech acts. It's restricting our Long from even thinking about or trying to use certain individual speech acts so that we're less aware of it. It's less of a direct infringement on our freedoms and operates more on things that we're not consciously aware of, our potentials that we never realize or turn into a reality. So as I said, we can't escape discourse because it's what socially constructs our identities and our experiences of everyday life and reality and our ways of talking and thinking and acting. And since discourse is inextricable from the power relations that produce it, we can't escape power either. We are always participating in power as long as we're participating in the exchange and production of meaning and culture. So to be a member of a culture is not just to possess and exchange meaning in relation to communication. It's to possess, exchange, and be subject to relations of power. And as I said, there's no place that's free of power. Freedom isn't escaping from power relations. It's recognizing that power is everywhere and thus struggling against it. The awareness and the struggle is what constitutes freedom for Foucault. And we need to find freedom within power by resisting the actions upon actions that it's wielding upon us and conducting our conduct and transgressing and railing against the established state of affairs, the way things are, the current flows of power. And this resistance and this freedom occurs on the micro levels of society just as much as the big picture macro levels of sovereign power in society, so that you are always a social actor within power relations in any given moment, in any given situation in everyday life, whether personal or social or however seemingly trivial and inconsequential. There are still very real, concrete implications for what your potential for action is and how it's being structured and how you can exert your agency to fight against the structure and open up more potential actions for yourself. So Foucault advanced a really novel conception of what power is and how it functions. Like, we tend to think of power in that official capital P power kind of way, as always going in a single direction, usually from top to bottom, and coming from a specific source like a government or sovereign or ruling class. But for Foucault, power doesn't function in this linear ladder-like hierarchy. It circulates in a decentralized fashion. It's never centralized in one area. It's diffuse. It's spread through the air. Like I said, it's the air around us. And thus we are all caught up in the plays of power and its circulation. And we're acting at any given moment in overlapping relationships of dominator and dominated, oppressor and oppressed, depending on where our positions are within that given discourse at any given time. Power relations permeate all levels of social existence and are therefore to be found operating at every site of social life. In the informal spheres of private, personal, family, sexual spheres of everyday life and identity formation, just as much as those formal public spheres of politics and the economy and the law. So power for Foucault has two defining characteristics depending on, again, what position you find yourselves in any given discourse, and the power that it either allows or disallows in terms of, are you the dominator or the dominated? Firstly, power is strategic. It's not just this neutral thing that spreads in random directions willy-nilly. It is deliberately harnessed in strategic and tactical ways by the shapers of discourse and those who are already in established positions of power, such as institutions and elites in society, in which power is the deliberate choices one makes in seeking to gain an advantage over others and become the winning strategy, and the tactical procedures used in any given situation to deprive the opponent of their means of, like I said, potential for action and for struggle and for combat against these everyday tactics of power. And secondly, power is struggle. Even if none of us have formal official power and we are in a subjugated, a dominated power relationship, we still always have the ability to struggle against it and potentially change it. And this entails a discursive struggle over the collectively shared meanings of words and symbols. Like I said, we're the originators of meaning, we're the producers of meaning, and thus we can change the existing meanings and the practices and the knowledge and truth associated with it, which will change the power associated with it. So it's not a struggle to escape and run away from power or discourse. It's the constant ongoing struggle to insubordinately and obstinately resist and refuse the power relations that shape us at any given time and shape our experience of everyday life and our potential for action, constantly testing the limits of that power that's acting upon our actions and conducting our conduct, and potentially destabilizing it and opening up for reversal, where we turn the tables and reverse the flow of power in a different direction, to at the very least stop them from becoming established and institutionalized and entrenched, and thus keeping them open for contestation and allow for new potentials for action to emerge. So the problem with sovereign power is that the holders of power noted that it was very inefficient and had to be manually wielded. Like back in the days of those historical monarchies, if someone committed a crime, the form of punishment at the time was, like we said, a public execution, such as the guillotine or public hangings. And the reason for the publicity of this punishment was to deter others who were watching from committing these crimes, because they don't want to be up there on the guillotine. But this intervention on behalf of the sovereign to step in and punish those who committed offenses against them was very expensive for power holders to have to frequently step in and directly exercise their sovereign power. Also pretty ineffective, because sometimes the public nature of this punishment could lead to people sympathizing with the criminal. So sovereign power was too expensive, inefficient, it had to be manually wielded. Like the social elites and the ruling classes, they don't want to have to get up off their throne and walk to a public execution to get it done every time. Like they want to be sipping on their wine and enjoying a feast while their power is being indirectly, automatically wielded on their behalf. And you can't get that with sovereign power. So this led to the transition in societies from sovereign power to disciplinary power. And disciplinary power flows more automatically without the power holders having to manually intervene and step in to directly exert their power. And that's when public executions and the guillotine and hangings were gradually replaced over time, and criminals were instead subjected to reformation, like I said, the reforming of their characteristics and behaviors to turn them into obedient, docile, well-behaved citizens that will act in accordance to the power holders' rules and governance without stepping out of line and without requiring the power holders to step in and intervene. It just happens by itself automatically. So this is where we get the prison system as a disciplinary technique to remold the criminal into a law-abiding citizen. And beyond just the specific spaces of prisons, this disciplinary power can be seen to operate in every space of everyday life that we inhabit. So disciplinary power is the power that operates in social spaces to instill certain habits on the individuals who occupy these spaces. Habits that are considered desirable by and productive for the power holders and the discourse shapers who own and operate these spaces. The power holders and discourse shapers have a vested interest in making people subjects of that discourse because it ensures that their habits and thoughts and behaviors are conducive to them remaining subordinate and passive in the power relationship between they and the holders and facilities of power in any given space or social situation. So it's the power that operates through social spaces like prisons, but also medical clinics, workplaces, schools, churches, shopping malls, etc., to strictly supervise the actions of individuals and build certain identities and subjectivities for those subject to that discourse to adopt in order to possess meaning and be a meaningful participant in that social space and its related discourse, such as the prisoner, the clinically ill, the productive worker, the model student, the perfect soldier, the ideal consumer or shopper. So all social spaces are physical structures with their own accompanying discourse. So academic discourse, medical discourse, religious discourse, etc., and signs surrounding that space. So the desks that students sit in, or the doctor's white lab coats, or the priest's various colored robes, to prompt individuals who enter these spaces to modify their habits, practices, and behaviors, and thus their modes of thinking and self-identifying and identifying with the social world around them by drilling into them certain practices and maybe employing certain signs to direct their behavior, or certain surveillance techniques or architectural techniques to channel their movements. So the prison cell or the school hallway, and constrain individuals' potential for action when operating as we find ourselves in these everyday spaces. So whenever you enter into one of these environments, you must fit yourself generally within its discursive formations and become to some degree the subject it is structured to produce by performing the movements and practices and routines and rituals laid out for you by that space and its discourse, to the point where you eventually believe that you are truly the productive, obedient subject who these discursive formations mold you into. So prisons create the subject position of prisoners, schools create students, stores create shoppers, etc. So wielding and exercising this disciplinary power amounts to structuring people's experience of their surrounding space and concepts of time to discipline them and subconsciously train them to interpret themselves and others in prescribed ways. For example, the rigid timetables that prisoners and factory workers must adhere to, so that these spaces use their discursively allowed practices and rituals to drill into individuals a strict mode of conduct that benefits those who operate the space. So the operator of the school or the prison or the military barracks or the store. And these individuals come to believe it as the truth about themselves, that this is the way they are. And they see themselves as the source or the originator of this artificially implanted conduct. So that they see these arbitrarily constructed ways of experiencing and behaving as a natural part of their identity, such as the reformed prisoner or the productive worker or the obedient soldier. So disciplinary power is not an oppressive form of power, but rather it's a productive form of power, in that power produces us. Power produces who we are and who we think of ourselves as, and thus how we act and interact with others in the social world. Disciplinary power doesn't oppress our interests or desires, but instead guides us towards reconstructed patterns of behavior that produces in us certain thoughts and desires and interests that leads us to naturally act in accordance with the ways that those in power want us to act. So according to Foucault, this happens in basically any social space. There's disciplinary power operating within that space and time. Disciplinary power creates a certain type of individual by producing new movements and habits and skills. It organizes people in time and space and employs certain techniques to keep them within certain buffers or outlines of behavior, so that we do have some leeway. We do have a bit of mobility, and we could think of that as freedom. We see that as true freedom, even though if we were to test the limits a bit more, we would see that we are still being contained and enclosed, so that we can only act within certain ranges of behavior. So think of like the buffers in a bowling lane. Like, you ever play bowling where they get rid of the gutters, so you can't possibly go into the gutters or go out of the line, and instead your ball, there's still some movement in the ball side to side, but it's still always within the buffers. So they prompt our behaviors to ensure that we stay within the lines and are naturally obedient without needing to be forced to. Because like I said, that's expensive, that's inefficient to have to punish someone after they committed a crime or offense. So might as well mold in them certain behaviors so they don't even think about or try to commit a crime or offense. According to Foucault, the formula, the model for disciplinary power can be seen in philosopher Jeremy Bentham's prototype for his optimal prison, based on hierarchical observation, which he called the Panopticon, which means all-seeing. Pan means like universal, everywhere, and then optic, it refers to sight and vision. So Bentham's model of the panoptic prison consists of a circular building where each cell is inhabited by one prisoner, and every cell is facing the middle of the room and exposed to the all-seeing eye of the guard tower in the middle of the circle, which can observe all prisoners at once. So this feeling of your cell being exposed to this panoptic vision ensures that prisoners will automatically be on their best behavior, even if there aren't any guards in the tower. Like, the point is for the windows on the guard tower to be tinted, so you can never see who's watching or if there's anyone in there watching to begin with. And since they can never truly know, they'll just assume that they're being watched at all times, and they will thus internalize the disciplinary power and regulate their own behavior as if they were constantly being watched. And even though his prototype, his template, never became the conventional model for prison design, this panoptic formula has extended and been applied to, like I said, all social sites and spaces where this disciplinary technique employs methods and technologies of surveillance to create a sense of rational self-control within us, so that the panoptic observation is internalized by individuals who watch themselves and surveil themselves and monitor their own actions to make sure they're not doing anything that could be seen as wrong or improper if they're being watched. So let's say you walk into a store and you see a security camera or surveillance camera, and you're going to automatically and almost subconsciously act as if you know you're being watched, and you'll be well behaved. You'll mind your own behavior. You'll watch your own behavior, even though there could be no one watching on the other side of that camera. It might not even be turned on. It's just the idea of being under surveillance that makes us surveil ourselves and judge ourselves as we engage in self-surveillance that ensures we don't act out of line, even when there's no one continuously there to directly and manually tell us or physically force us to act otherwise. Because like I said, that's expensive. Putting a bunch of fake security cameras everywhere costs a lot less than the cost it takes to imprison or execute someone. This way, people will preemptively be obedient and well-behaved, so that those in power don't need to manually step in and intervene and change their behavior. It's already being molded automatically, so that individuals in society stay within a defined range of normalized actions without straying beyond them. It's much easier and cheaper to prevent a crime than to punish it after it's already been committed. And it doesn't just have to be like surveillance technologies. It could be just about any technique that governs our behavior in this automatic, indirect way. So Nietzsche saw the construction of morality in his genealogy of morals as this way for us to monitor our own behavior and to judge ourselves and to say, am I being moral right now? And keep in mind, morality is a social construction that's only relative to the cultural and historical context in which it circulates. So it doesn't necessarily need to be this sophisticated technological thing. It could be as simple as tweaking the meanings of certain concepts in discourse, such as the concept of morality, to develop within people a tendency to watch themselves and monitor their behavior so that they don't need to be directly monitored by a higher power. So this is where the conduct at a distance comes from. Like, the people who are wielding power over us in any given moment, they're not directly in our proximity. We can't see them wielding their power over us. All they need to do is put in place certain discursive elements or techniques or practices or spaces or technologies and let them do the work for them. And then they can go on vacation somewhere or sit on their throne or wherever they are, comfortable with the fact that they're still wielding power over us by putting these mechanisms in place that prompt and nudge us to act in certain ways and to not act in other ways without them even having to lift a finger, because we are disciplining ourselves and molding ourselves with these automated habits so that it feels natural and comfortable and easy for us. And we eagerly want to act in these ways that benefit them over us. Like I said, with the example of the discursive construction of morality, we all want to be a good person. We all want to see ourselves as a moral person. So we drive ourselves to act in ways that we think are naturally good, but they're arbitrarily socially constructed by those in power to indirectly conduct our conduct at a distance. So let's finish talking about Foucault by briefly emphasizing what I mean by subject. Because when I mean subject, I don't mean like a topic, as in like let's change the subject or the subject heading of an email. I mean subjects such as your loyal subjects, as in subjecting yourself to a higher power, but I also mean subjects as in reference to our subjectivity, like your subjective position within discourse and within its webbings of everyday meaning making that give our actions and words and thoughts and experiences meaning that is recognizable to both ourselves and others under the reigning discourse. So, subjects are a combination of subjectivity, our individual identities and personalities and dispositions, as well as subjection, that is being dependent on someone else's control. So that to define your identity, to structure your subjectivity, is inherently to be tied to forms of social control. For Foucault, the chains that bind us aren't literal physical chains as it is with sovereign power. Our identities are the chains that bind us and restrict and channel and control our actions and behaviors. So that if you identify, like I said, as the moral subject, you are going to act in a certain way. And that way of acting entails being subject to certain social powers and forms of social control. And it's important to emphasize that we, as subjects, as individuals, are created through discourse. Just like the tree falling in the forest, we wouldn't possess any meanings without discourse. There is no such thing as a fully formed, pre-existing individual who consciously enters into discourse as an already formed being, who's capable of rational decision-making and possesses an essential core, regardless of discourse. We and our identities and our subjectivities are contingent on the discourse surrounding us. We are not the independent, authentic source of action and meaning. We construct discourse, but discourse constructs us. First, it's the chicken or the egg situation. Like, yeah, we can change the meanings of words, but it's based on our pre-existing meanings that we entered into the social world with already. And that meanings weren't created by us. Like, it's not the intentional model, it's the constructivist model. So these are the social constructed and discursively constructed meanings that shape who we are as people and how we experience the social world around us. So discourse produces a place, a position for the subject to occupy from which their particular knowledge and meanings make the most sense. All individuals in any given period will become the subjects of a particular discourse and thus the bearers of its power and knowledge. So in order for us to possess meaning, we need to occupy one of the positions that discourse opens up for us, a subject positions, if you will, where we subject ourselves to that discourse's meanings and power and regulation. All discourses construct certain subject positions that we occupy and which allows for our actions, thoughts, and communication to make sense in that particular place and time. So an example that I like to use to demonstrate this concept of a subject position doesn't work as well teaching online, but when I used to teach in person, I would always sit on the desk as opposed to sitting on a chair. And no one ever questioned it or challenged it or spoke out against it. I was able, in my subject position as teacher, with the power and authority vested into that subject position within the discourse of school and academia, I had the ability to sit on the desk with impunity. My field for potential action was greater than the field of potential action for a student, because not one student in the history of my teaching has ever thought to themselves, maybe I'll sit on the desk too. And that's because from the subject position of the student, with which all of you willingly adopt whenever you enter into a classroom or any school setting, you all want to see yourselves as a student and as a good student. You want to possess meaning within this discourse and fit in. And the only subject position that's allowed for you to occupy is that of a student, which has certain potentials for action, but also limiting your conduct in other ways. Academic discourse associates certain behaviors with certain desirable outcomes, such as being a good student, so that you are conditioned to perform those behaviors as if you genuinely want to and can't possibly think of any other ways of conducting yourselves. So it's inconceivable. The thought of even sitting on the desk doesn't even enter your mind. It's been pre-consciously eliminated so that you don't feel like you're being restricted. You don't feel like power is being wielded upon you because you don't even consciously consider like, oh, I'd like to sit on my desk, but I can't. Like that consideration doesn't even come into your conscious mind. That's what I mean by discourse structuring the field of possible actions. You as a student in your subject position, your field for potential actions and behaviors and thoughts and ways of saying things and thinking things and doing things and just being in general is limited in subtle ways so that you are always acting and thinking and talking within an acceptable range. You don't need to be exactly the same as all students because again, that would be too blatantly and obviously oppressive. But the discourse, instead of being oppressive, it's productive. It produces you in your subjectivity as a student. And that subjectivity entails subjection to certain powers, which structures your field of potential action so that you never even consider the possibility of potentially sitting on the desk. So that you in your subject position as a student have effectively internalized this power and disciplined yourself without anyone having to say, like there are no signs in a classroom saying, please don't stand on the desk, or me as a teacher, I don't have to come in and say, okay guys, I gotta say again, please don't sit on the desk. Like none of that needs to be said outwardly because it's an implicit thing. Like I said about disciplinary power, it operates automatically without those in power having to step in and intervene and change our conduct. We change our own conduct for the benefit of those in power because it's inseparable from our subjectivity as a student within this discourse, so that there don't need to be any external enforcement of that power. We are constantly wielding power on ourselves through self-monitoring and self-discipline and saying, oh, I don't want to be seen as a bad student if I do this. So that panoptic power is being internalized within you and you're watching yourself and you can't even conceive of modes of conduct beyond the range of acceptable behavior that's allowed within your subject position as a student of academic discourse, and thus a subject of that discourse, subject to its unspoken rules and regulations of behavior. So like subjectivity is not natural. It's not like you were already thinking and acting like a student before entering school. It was only once you enter the school that your subjectivity is molded into that set of conduct and range of possible behaviors and ways of identifying yourself and thinking about yourself and others and interacting with that and others. So discourse is constantly constructing our own perpetually unfinished subjectivity into specific subjects, that of the student, for example, who are recognizable and meaningful and have a place or position within the reigning discourse, a subject position. And it just so happens that all of the available and authorized subject positions that a discourse allows you to occupy and become are those which entail conducting ourselves in ways in which we voluntarily submit to various power relations and limit our own field of potential action without even being consciously aware of it, and never pose a threat to those in dominant positions within the discourse. And like I said, this is what we mean by saying power is subtly productive rather than blatantly oppressive. It exerts control by producing us and our subjectivity in ways that gently prod and nudge us and build ourselves in certain ways at the expense of other ways, thereby prescribing ways of being that seem to naturally make sense to us and others within discourse, and producing loyal subjects who don't challenge or destabilize the balance of power in social relations. So freedom lies in our capacity to overcome ourselves and thus break those invisible chains that bind us in the form of our identities and how restrictive these subjectivities are pre-consciously, and thus opening up our potential for action to conceive of new meanings and new ways of thinking and communicating and being in life and everyday life.